few people here and a few people more I see gradually coming in. So first I'll just say welcome to, we're having a chat, as you know, about raw ales, particularly, hopefully bring in a little bit more of the farmhouse brewing techniques and history, but mainly I think it'll mainly focus on raw ales. I think given our time constraints and all that, I think there's enough there to do. So just a little housekeeping. If you're watching this, I'm streaming this on Facebook, so if you're watching there, you can watch, but I won't be monitoring too many comments. If you want to comment and get involved, just go along to the yourfest.com website, register. You will get a link and you can be in 2 minutes, and you can kind of take part that way. So I'll tell you who we have with us today. We have Jan and Eric from Butcher's Tears, who disappeared there. We've Janis from Dochter here. We have Declan from Otterbank, but I think sound and camera difficulties right now, so hopefully we'll get those sorted and we'll see if he comes back. And we also, of course, have Lars Garshol who's not a brewer, but I think everybody knows he's pretty much the expert in this area. So I mean, that both Doc and Butcher's Tears obviously are brewers. Lars got into this, I think his wife, if I'm not wrong, Lars, your wife gave you a book and has probably ever since regretted that you went down a rabbit hole.
I don't know if she regrets it, but it's true that she did give me a book by a Danish brewer who was he wanted to create a kind of Nordic beer, and he was looking at the traditional beers for inspiration.
Right.
Then he was disappointed.
Yeah, and then if I understand right, you went to Lithuania and kind of never stopped looking after that. You have a bad signal there too, I think. A couple of bad signals. Yeah, there's coming in. There you are. You're coming back in and out. So look, let's just maybe kick this off. Maybe, Lars, since I have you here, and you've started talking, maybe you could just give us a brief overview of what exactly is a raw ale and where does it fit into kind of brewing tradition, brewing history.
Right. I guess the way to start is by looking at the fact that originally people couldn't afford metal kettles. They were extremely expensive historically, and so people had to find other ways to mash, basically, which is where stone brewing comes from. There's a very distracting echo, but I don't know who's coming from. It might be you, Brian. Yeah. Anyway, so because of this people not having kettles, they generally mashed in wooden vessels using hot stones, and of course, if you do that, you are not going to boil the wort because you don't need to, and it's a lot of work. So historically, probably all beer was raw ale, and there are actually indications that the people who really started with boiling were the Germans in, let's say, the 12th, 13th century, who started boiling the wort with hops, and that this afterwards spread. So it's not proven, but it's thought that the original English ale, which was unhopped, probably was also not boiled. We don't know that for certain. And then boiling kind of spread out, but there's still pockets of people who don't boil. So I guess the Baltic countries, parts of Norway, all of Denmark when it had farmhouse brewing, and parts of Sweden, very likely also parts of Russia, but we don't know very much about it. That's a very brief intro, I guess.
Right. Well, that's all we need to start. So, okay. So Declan's just told me, sorry, that he's having issues. He's going to keep trying to join us. But so yeah. So if I understand right, then raw ales have been pretty much up to the majority of time, but but except for a few pockets, like I said, why do you think Scandinavia and the Baltics kept it?
I think it's more the thing that stands out is probably more that they kept their farmhouse brewing more than that they kept the raw ale. I forgot Finland, which is also a non-boil area. If you look at, say, German farmhouse brewing or British farmhouse brewing, I'm pretty sure you will find people who don't boil. It's just very hard to find the documentation. We know that the Austrian stone beer, for example, was raw.
Okay. And how
but again, it's underdocumented.
Right. So Janis or Jan or Eric, what maybe what led you? We know where Lars kind of stumbled into farmhouse brewing and raw ales. What led you into looking into raw ales? Did you know what you were looking for, or did you stumble into it as well and just drink this and then say, what is this, and then go investigating, or did you know what you were drinking first and know anything about it? Janis, do you want to take that?
Yeah. Well, basically, the first time I drank a raw ale, I didn't even knew I was drinking a raw ale. I went to Estonia. I think it's about 4 or 5 years ago now to brew my first collab with Tanker back then, and I went to a dark cellar, which is called Porhu, basically hell in Estonian. And I drank a beer which I really liked the mouthfeel a lot. I really liked the yeast profile a lot, and it was called Koduvolo. Didn't know anything about it, and then I did some research on it. Eventually, I found out that it was a raw ale, and through that beer, I ended up on Lars's blog. And of course, once you reach Lars's blog, yeah, it's a humongous source of information. But so yeah, the first time was in Estonia, and without even knowing that it was something special, yeah, if you try it, if you taste it, it really hits you. It's something different than you're used to drinking. And I drank quite some beers in my life already, so yeah, it really shocked me. And then of course after the Kurulu and after starting reading Lars's blog, then I went to the Cornell Festival, and then I completely fell in love with the traditions, with the techniques, with the styles, with the people behind it, with the homebrewers. In Belgium, we also have a small homebrewing scene, but of course they all mimic the Americans, or sometimes they try to make some traditional Belgian beers. But we lost that tradition, and the humbleness and the pureness, and also the pride in brewing is huge in Norway. So basically, that was my start, and from then on, I went to basically travel a little bit more to visit some more brewers who brew those kinds of styles.
Yeah, to be honest, I was in Lithuania over the summer. When I came back, I actually met Jeff from Hoften Dormel. I was just telling him that I was there and that I'd tried a Royal, and he out of the blue he mentioned you, Janis, and said, "Oh, Janis, I'll paraphrase. He basically said you were obsessed with it. No, he said you never stopped. Once you started drinking it, you never stopped."
Yeah, it's something. It really hit me, and especially after the Korenaar festival. Then a year later, or maybe 2 years later, I traveled to Estonia again, to Saaremaa, to basically meet the brewer who brewed the beer, which was Pichla. Then, of course, on the Korenaar festival, I also met the other Pichla brewery, which is pretty funny because they're basically, they live across the street. They're not best friends, not at all. But I had the honor to brew with both of them. And then we imported the beer in Belgium. And according to my knowledge, that was the first Kudolo imported in Belgium. And then we did like an honor, basically how do we call it? I think it was, basically we call it Farmhouse Day or something. And so we brought the beer in Belgium, and then we divided the beer over several bars in Belgium and Holland to show the people what a royal was. And in the beginning, everybody thought like, Janos, you made a lot of beers yet, but now you lost it. Like not boiling beer, like adding baker's yeast. Like we saw the pictures, how those guys brew. It's impossible that this beer is going to be nice, and everybody was, yeah, they, everybody was how would I say it, like pleasantly surprised.
How
So
about you?
yeah, and then Corona hit. Like it was actually my idea to do it like on a yearly base, to travel to a different region and import the style in Belgium and Holland, to let the people know how those styles work and how they taste, because it's so hard to get them here, to ship them fresh. So wintertime is perfect. Uh, well, of course, yeah, what's happening now in the world makes it a little bit more difficult to set up a thing,
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
How about you, Jan, Eric? I mean, you've been brewing. Like first, what was the first raw ale you had? Did you know what it was? Did you go in, or did it come as a surprise like it did with Lars and Janis?
Yeah, I never drank one before I made one myself, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been reading about it in books. Or, yeah, I've been reading books on farmhouse brewing, and it surprised me that the boilings that was omitted. After a while, I realized that that was a technique, or an anti-technique. So I started experimenting with it myself, and I realized that, well, it's actually an unnecessary step. You can make perfect beers without, and it becomes different and interesting. And then I've been fooling around with it.
Right. Yeah, I actually
works.
have your one in front of me here. It's the only one I had this extra special that you're doing that's unboiled. So how did you decide to do that?
It was an experimental brew. I had some time and a spare tank, so I just went ahead. There's no particular thought behind this beer. I think I wanted to try out some the oak smoked wheat malt that I got, and I thought that was a nice thing to do with a raw ale. That's it.
Okay.
No fuss.
It's a nice beer, but yeah, that's something that I was wondering. Is there? I mean, everybody talks about the mouthfeel, but is there any kind of? I've only had two raw ales. I'm going to put my hand up here. I've only had two, and the first one of them is this extra special. The other one was Yoveru, which probably Lars would probably say there's so much happening in that one you can't really tell what what's the raw ale and what's all the other yeasts and stuff. So apart, like, there's the mouthfeel, but is there a common taste that's different for raw ales? Is there something that you can say, apart from the richness of the mouthfeel? How do you know?
Yeah, there's absolutely characteristics, flavors, but it's kind of it's not trivial to describe. One thing that tends to be in common is that you taste the flavor of the malt a lot more. But it also comes out in a different way. So you get these green kind of like flavors. But I've never come up with a good way to describe it, and it tends to be a little different from beer to beer. But there is a characteristic flavor that you can learn to recognize. Absolutely. You also kind of see it when you look at the beer, because the unboiled ones tend to have this kind of grayish color, which is actually quite easy to recognize once you know to look for it.
Okay. How about yourself, Janis? Would you agree? And like, is there a flavor that you spot every time you say this is a raw ale, or is it, have you had enough experience in that? Or if you've drunk a lot of them, what struck you?
But to be honest, part of it you can really put your finger on that it's a raw unboiled beer. Like the mouthfeel that we're constantly talking about, the grains, the cereals, the malts you try, what Lars said, it's really something typical for raw ales. But then, of course, the way of working with a lot of those brewers is really so rudimentary that you get a kind of approach, kind of style of a beer, kind of a flavor profile which makes it really mysterious because you really don't know where it actually all comes from. Because then, of course, we didn't mention Kveik yet. Kveik is also like a big factor in a lot of those beers. Or if they use baker's yeast, like with the Dochter or with the Korenaar, that's also something completely different. Than they don't. They have no temperature control at all. So, are there? Is it because of the non-boiling, or is it because of the yeast, which does really funky stuff? Because of its genes and the way they handle it, also the way they brew it. Yeah, they don't have pumps. They use buckets. The wort gets a lot of oxygen while brewing. Um, there's a lot of things going on, and I think there's way too little research about it to really put your finger on what's happening there. There's a lot of mysticism, which makes it so beautiful too.
Yeah. Yeah. So no. Yeah. No. So does that mean that you think? I suppose again, yeah, we're trying to separate out like raw ale doesn't have to be up. It's a subset of farmhouse ales, I suppose. So how do you separate those out? Like farmhouse ales, they're kind of becoming commercial. Raw ales haven't yet, but how do you separate all that out? Like if you wanted to brew it to sell as opposed to just kind of brewing it to give to your neighbors or something, how do you separate all that out?
You mean how would you describe it on the label?
Yeah, that's the first part, I suppose. Yeah, how would you?
Yeah. Well, I guess one way to do it is if you brew, an existing farmhouse style, you can label it as that. The other is if you just come up with, some recipe of your own, then I suppose you could just call it a raw ale. Of course, nobody knows what you mean by that, but at least it would be accurate. But I think that just not boiling doesn't make it a farmhouse ale. It's much more common in farmhouse brewing, of course, but that in itself doesn't turn it into a farmhouse ale, in my opinion. I guess you could say you took one technique from farmhouse brewing, which is fair enough.
Yeah, so I guess the other side of that coin is like, how can you commercialize this? Can it be commercialized? Does that kill it if you're trying to make it a commercial thing that you're selling, widely? Does that kill the whole farmhouse, the whole raw ales, or does it just change it?
Well, I don't think let's say you start brewing a raw ale and it's commercially successful. Why should that cause people to stop brewing farmhouse ale? I don't think it would. In fact, I think it would be more likely the other way around, because it's been a big problem for, at least in some of these farmhouse brewing regions, that people look down on unboiled ale, and they know the textbooks say that you shouldn't be doing this. And so the locals have had to do a good bit of fighting against prejudice, basically. But to see that brewing method being used commercially and being commercially successful, that would really be a quite strong argument the other way, right? And it would help lift the self-confidence of the people who brew this way.
Yeah, you think? Yeah, you agree, Janis? Is that something that you're trying to do by bringing all this in? That you're trying to?
To be honest, if you brew a style like that, it's just for fun. We don't think about commercializing. Yeah, the beauty of those styles is that they're so small and that they have this romantic approach. And I think if you blow it up too much, or if you commercialize it too much, that it will eventually break down itself. It's like the term craft. Like 20, 30 years ago, craft beer was something beautiful. Nowadays, everybody's making craft beer. Farmhouse basically is the same thing. Like everybody's fighting for the term farmhouse. Well, what is a farmhouse ale? Yeah, we have our saisons in Belgium. They're also called farmhouse ales. We have those sour saisons, basically mixed fermentation ales from the States or from wherever in the world. They also call them farmhouse ales. You have the raw ales from the north. They're also called farmhouse ales. And a lot of times people ask me, what is a farmhouse ale? Like, it's really hard to put your finger on. It's more about a feeling. And if you see somebody who's brewing a farmhouse ale, you can really say, hey, this is farmhouse. Or if you try some kind of beers, it's more a feeling than it is a definition. I don't think you can put it in a small cube. Um, if raw ales can be commercialized, I think that's a different thing. Like last year, I was approached by the University of Ghent, and they're going to set up a project. Now it's in its baby shoes, but I think next year on they're going to put a PhD on it about integrating raw ale, basically the techniques from raw ale brewers in modern brewing. Because of course, cost efficiency wise, time wise, labor wise, it makes sense. If a big brewery can just cut the boiling and make a stable beer, why wouldn't they? But that's another discussion, of course. But
That's interesting, though. It's interesting to see that that there's that much interest that maybe a big brewer would do it, because, like you said, it's so different from your regular IPAs. That would people just do it? Do you think there's a market for people to like as big a market?
I would like to do it, but every once in a while, well, every time you brew something, it's something completely different. So if you brew something completely wild, people won't be shocked. Of course, we want to make good beers, so we need to be sure of what we're doing. So we already made like a small batch of captinis. We did small raw experiments, and now in the near future, we're basically going to do a mixed fermentation raw ale too. But really baby steps. But from the moment on, the university in Belgium, in Leuven or in Ghent, is setting up that project. I'm gonna be like in the more or less in the council. I'm not a researcher. I'm a passionate brewer. I'm not a scientist, but I'm gonna be in the board, and I basically with all the information they're gonna provide, we would really love to put royals on a different, not level, but a different approach. Yeah, to see what the possibilities are.
That's exciting. That must be something that's keeping you. Give you plenty to do.
Yeah.
How about you, Jan? Up there, like you're selling commercial raw ales. Is that a hard thing? Is it hard to persuade people to buy it first? And second, is it how do you keep it then fresh? That's one thing that I wanted to ask everybody about. You keep it that it has to be fresh because it goes off because all the protein go.
Well, actually, this was brewed, I think, 8 months ago.
Yeah.
So I mean, raw ales, I think, is a descriptive term. It's not a style or a category, and like we should keep in mind that it's a helpful term that reveals something, but it also obscures something. During your introduction, I was thinking earlier, we can actually think partially Berliner Weisses were raw ales. And that's commercialized beers, I think, up to the 60s or 70s. So in that sense, raw ale as a category, we are talking about maybe what Lars is saying, Scandinavian and Latvian beer types that employ the technique of unboiled beers. And this was actually also commercially used in German brewing and possibly in some other brewing cultures that I'm not aware as well. But well, we're brewing and we are operating on a rather small scale. So to be honest, like all our batches are 10 hecto. It's not so much of a concern for us we are not approaching brewing the beers with the concern of having to sell them. Because one thing which I guess the commercialization of raw ales always throws up the challenge, and I think I can probably would say it doesn't, that everybody thinks raw ales can't last. And this is an 8-month-old beer, and it's holding up perfectly fine, and I think actually it's developing over time really nicely. And if I understood well, most of the Icon-Teat raw ales are actually matured beers, which are often aged on a barrel or matured on a barrel for like a year plus or 2 years plus. So I think the important thing to understand is that within the Scandinavian and Latvian, Russian, Eastern European culture, raw ales are young beers or consumed young, which is not the only way raw ales can be approached or consumed. Like raw ale is a technique that can be employed in different ways in different brewing cultures. And well, the only way it finds attention is currently in the Scandinavian. But so I think establishing raw ale as a category is not so interesting. it's interesting for a small group of drinkers who are curious to learn more about beers. But I don't think we will talk about raw ales as a category in 3 years, something like this. Like if you look at beer, how we separate and talk about it, like we have this older system that we kind of talk about beer as national cultures, whereas we already noticed that it breaks down on like saisons, like there's Northern French saisons and Belgian saisons, but we group them as Belgian kind of beers. And you have the same as well with like German beers, but then you also see huge differences where, let's say, the more northern German cold brewing cultures share very little with what we consider modern German beer, which come much more of a Bavarian brewing culture. So it's just another framework. I think that's important to keep in mind. And for our brewing, we usually try to get people interested in beer cultures rather than beers itself. So like another beer of ours, which we opened earlier, it's not a raw ale, but it's a smoky farmhouse ale where we kind of forage juniper branches and we just use them as a filtering system. And I think flavor is something that people can approach it usually either through the lens of another culture or understanding that it's a practice. And I think that's how we are kind of not trying to sell them, but that's how we are kind of trying to introduce people into the different techniques and the different flavors that these techniques bring with them.
Okay, so you're downplaying the raw bit and just saying this is a Scandinavian style farmhouse beer that you should try if you're interested in that culture.
Well, actually, for example, there's Extra Special. On the label, we call it an oak smoked unboiled spring ale fermented on wood. But, well, I mean, what does it really mean and who buys that because of it? It maybe interests someone, but so something which we started, I think, a few years ago is that most of our beers aren't to styles. Styles is something which is a good guidance system, but it doesn't mean particularly anything. So we started actually to use two different descriptions on the label, one on the front, what I just read you, and on the side then would say something different, which is basically kind of trying to open up this idea instead of this is an IPA. No, these are just descriptive terms which kind of try to get at the beer underneath of it.
Right. I think, Janis, just to come back to something you had there, you were talking about this PhD and you mentioned, why wouldn't big brewers want to save the time on, by not boiling. So obviously you save the time, but is there anything more complex in the technique in that you have to learn, or you have to, that would make it, that would balance that out, that would kind of, make it a negative on the other side, or is it all just positive?
Well, of course, the research hasn't been done, but like as a brewer, my two biggest priorities would be one, DMS, because of the not boiling. But I believe if you don't, if you don't cross 80 degrees or 78 degrees, you don't make the precursor of DMS. So if you don't boil, it's not a problem. But of course, from the moment if you heat up above 80 degrees, you'll eventually get DMS, and then your beer will taste like vegetable or like corn, and nobody will want that. Another, probably the biggest issue with non-boiling is the stability of the beer, the colloidal. It's hard to say it in English. Colloidal stability, basically the protein stability, because eventually the proteins, they will settle down, and they will make basically really ugly chunks, and they'll drop down. Then you get a beer with some protein chunks in them. So definitely on a commercial scale, nobody is waiting for a beer with big chunks in them. And sterility is also a big thing if you don't boil, and if you don't go above 80 degrees. Okay, you're pasteurizing, but will pasteurization kill everything? That's not a big issue. And I think those are the three biggest ones. And then by start commercializing those techniques, a ton more will be discovered that we're not thinking of right now.
I think the interesting thing is, I think that's what Lars figured out quite early once he started visiting brewers, is that you're looking at them brewing and you're looking at the brewing process, but because there's so much variety in like how is it boiled, what is the heat source, how is the heat distributed, what's the size of the containers, what's the shape of some containers, what is the process, you don't even really know what to pay attention to, right? And I mean, if you look at modern breweries, there's pretty much 2 or 3 different brewing installation setups that everybody is using. And that is a result out of having gone through that very fine-tuned process of saying, these are the things that matters for German brewing particularly, or for Belgium or British brewing. And then having local producers produce installations, fermenters, specifically for these aspects that brewers care about. And I think once we have, probably in 10, 15 years, have a much better understanding what it actually is that these farmhouse brewers care about, that they are not often able to conceptualize because they don't think in that same terms. We will also look at the same brewing setups of theirs again and see like, oh yeah, obviously what Janis just said, like not reaching 80 degree, like not reaching 80 degree. For them, it's not a thought that they are conscious about, but very likely through the setup, through the size of the kettles, or through the heat sources, they don't reach 80 degree, or they have processes built in that are justified differently that avoids them going there in the first place.
Yeah, I think that comes across a lot in Lars' book, when it just keeps coming up there that people are just doing things and they've no clue why they're doing it because they were just taught that. But when you look into it, like I'm thinking about lautering, there was certain, that I don't know, that it had to be the wort had to be a certain thickness, like it was a trickle coming out, and couldn't explain why, but it was, I can't remember, it was something to do with blockages or something like that. And all sort of thing.
If you go too fast, the grains come out and they stick in the tap and stuff like that. So you have to unclog it, and people get into trouble. Yeah, I think it's a very good points from both brewers here.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. So like that's all raw ales, and that's all. But the overall farmhouse, like saying, how is there seems to be more interest in farmhouse brewing generally than there was, and like I said, that there's a certain risk of it being just kind of claimed as, this is a farmhouse brew when it's got nothing at all to do with it. But how do you, I guess, how do you manage all that? How do you preserve the techniques as opposed to just, calling everything, having Guinness or someone producing a farmhouse beer that has never been near a farmhouse in its life,
Well, I think that it used to be that people were thinking that if it had mixed fermentation, or there was some weird yeast, or you were on a farm when you brewed it, that made it a farmhouse ale. So from my point of view, we used to be in a place where basically almost all farmhouse ale had nothing to do with farmhouse ale. So in that sense, I think the situation has improved a lot. But as for how to preserve the techniques, I mean, the most important thing, I think, is to keep the tradition alive, where it started, and to convince people to brew there. Which I think having people abroad copy these techniques and brew these beers is actually helpful. And writing books, having an online chat like this, I think all of these things actually help just by lifting the profile of these beers. Mainly because I think of this issue of self-confidence. People used to look down on these beers, and now, especially with all the interesting Kveik, you see signs that this is changing. So people in Voss, for example, tell me that now you hear people say things like, "Oh yeah, my grandpa was a brewer, and he was well known for making good beer," and they say you never heard that before. So I think that's very encouraging.
Well, I guess also sorry.
Yeah, I'll just a little bit more. And I think if this gets copied into commercial brewing, that's great. That's also helpful. That's just what I wanted to say.
Well, I guess interesting part is that basically we think of beer as it is now as something that it has been always. But I mean, just think about how we, what Lars just said, how we conceptualized beers 10 years ago, and it's barely recognizable. Look at like how yeast research has progressed in the last 10 years. And you would have to think like 10 years ago, we were all absolute foods. But obviously we still were producing pretty decent beers, all of us. So just a simple fact that 10 years ago we made decent beers, yet we didn't know many things. Show us that people 150, 200 years ago were probably able to produce really great beers. But the fact that people now say like, oh, my grandfather was a brewer, is that we have culturally through the last 100 years progressed. I assume in farmhouse brewing this is true, where farmhouse brewing was something that was commonplace. So somebody who brewed farmhouse ales wasn't per se a brewer, as we think of brewer as a profession or as something, a skill that's learned, but it was an activity. Everybody was a brewer. But whereas, like, if somebody says, no, my father was a brewer, it's like a speciously singled out task that is not commonplace in the culture anymore. So I assume farmhouse ales have, through the last 20, 30 years, passed through that valley where the cultural life of the people has changed, even though it's still probably fairly rural, has changed quite drastically, where brewing wasn't a social institution anymore in the same way it was possibly historically. I mean,
so do you think there's a danger of kind of fetishizing the whole thing and kind of trying to freeze it in time?
I think there's always a strong temptation to do that. I was doing a talk in Oslo on Norwegian Christmas traditions, and the guy who was hosting it said that this is one thing I always wondered, like the true Christmas tradition. How do you decide, what year that is? Is it the 1970s or the 1870s? I mean, and I don't think we should aim to freeze the tradition. I think that would be completely wrong, and I also think you probably can't do it, because people will do whatever they want. It's their own beer, right? I think one should resist the temptation to do that. But of course, to see people, if they start making IPA, then that's not the tradition developing. I would say that's kind of more it dying. So to have the tradition develop on its own terms, I guess is what you want. And if we're successful, I guess that's what's going to happen.
Yeah. So So I suppose it's as much about the beer, but it's as much about the tradition, the techniques, and doing, like Janis is saying, like the culture around it. Janis mentioned there.
Absolutely.
Well, I wanted to quickly say something about what you said about commercializing. We have another beer of ours, which is what we just call it Smoke and Mirrors. And on the label, we call it a triple hopped farmhouse ale. And what it is very much is, we don't frame it in a farmhouse ale tradition really, besides that little descriptor. But what it is, it's a beer that takes its flavor spectrum or idea of flavor from Gotlandsdrücke. It's a beer that's using beech, birch, and peat smoke malts. It's hopped quite heavily with American hops, and brewed to 8.5% with quite expressive yeast. The idea was just very much to kind of combine this smoky presence, this rather citric hop expression, yeast expression, dominant yeast expression that you possibly have in Gotlandsdrücke, but then get it from the hops. And it will never be a Gotlandsdrücke. It's not aiming to be a Gotlandsdrücke, but also the way I think it's interesting to evolve and develop beer is trying to breach into flavor spectrums that are very uncommon. And that's, I think, the opposite way how you see, let's say, for example, the IPA developing. That's why we have so many monikers of milkshake IPA. People actually look for descriptors that they are known with and then drive beer into that. And I think that's interesting for us as non-raw ale, non-farmhouse brewers, is to take insight into the flavors that other brewing cultures have developed for themselves locally, and see that we actually can move in this direction as well. But we don't have to per se, therefore, appropriate the style. Like American hops and smoked malts, I think is a wonderful combination. Yet you don't really see any IPA brewers experimenting with that at all. So
yeah, so that's the other thing. Are the ingredients, how, like most farmhouse brewing, I guess, like traditionally would, like we now have a choice. Like you can go out and you can pick any ingredients you want, whereas they were just whatever was on the farm, or at least locally. So where does that come into it? Where does, if you can pick anything you want to, can you? I guess I'm trying to formulate the question here in my own head as I'm speaking, but like, how does, when you have your choice of ingredients, the whole world is wide open to you. How does that fit in with the technique of farmhouse brewing? Then you're just, or does it make a difference? Like it's still the same brewing thing, but you have a choice. I guess let me try and pull it back. I'm thinking a couple of weeks ago I had Kjetil Jekun from. He was on, and he's been around about 20 years in Norway. He was brewing as one of the first, and now he's working with a Czech brewery. They have him as a consultant, and he was, before he went there 2 years ago, before he started working with them, he thought decoction there was no point to it. You just pick you pick your malts, you pick this, and you didn't need it. And he said, but after 2 years there, he has completely changed his mind. So what I guess about is like, how were the techniques differing versus the ingredients? Is there some?
Yeah.
And that makes any sense? I'm trying to think.
It makes a lot of sense, because I think one of the things that originally defined farmhouse ales was exactly this: that you were using your own ingredients. You were using the yeast that was in your village. You were using the grain that you yourself grew, probably the hops that you grew as well. And then essentially what happened was modernization, right? That we had this transformation in transport, where farmers were no longer subsistence farmers, but they started actually purchasing things. So they produced goods, or they grew things for sale, and then they started buying what they needed instead. And once that happened, you kind of broke this hyper-local ingredient connection, to some extent at least. Gotlandsdrikke and Norwegian Stjørdalsøl have preserved some of it since the malt is local for those two styles. But exactly as you were saying, the process remains the same, right? So the ingredient base is kind of swapped out to some extent, although not completely. And it does change the flavor a lot. Absolutely, it does. But if you drink, a Western Norwegian farmhouse ale where all of the ingredients are from the shop, it still doesn't taste like modern beer, and it's exactly because of the process differences, like you were saying. And of course, also to some extent, the ratio of the ingredients is completely different. They put together the recipe differently, and they put the emphasis of the flavors in a different place. But definitely the process and the equipment make a huge difference too.
Yeah, it runs again with the last time you were on. I think I asked that question about about what at that time we were talking about Lithuanian beers could bring to that, and there was Simonis said something that's stuck in my head ever since, that as a craft brewer, you want it to be about your technique, about your control and mastery of technique, and not just the ingredients and the recipe. I think does that make sense to you, Janis?
Yeah, I think that's partially true. I think as a craft brewer, that control is everything. The big difference, and that's probably also the reason why I'm so attracted to farmhouse techniques, is that basically what modern day craft brewers do is they're beer architects. I can make a recipe and I'll know on the paper how it will taste eventually, because we know our ingredients and we know our techniques, and we know if we combine those two, what we'll get. The with farmhouse brewing, I think there's still a lot of the brewers. They'll also know where they're going for, but it's also because they only brew that kind of beer. I guess let them brew something completely different, and they don't know where they're gonna end up. Is that an answer to your question?
I think so. Yeah. So like it's. Yeah, I suppose that is the other thing about the farmhouse. They were only brewing one beer for their whole life, so that was the technique, and they got good at that.
Yeah, the technique. Yeah, they're really good at that. But yeah, because repetition is everything. Yeah? If you repeat something over and over and over again, you get really good at it. Yeah, it's always super nice to talk to those people and to see like how they so trained to do it, but they don't really know why they're doing it. And then I wonder, and that's probably a question Lars can answer. Like every once in a while, probably they must change something. Like something of their equipment must change, or the ingredients must change. And then I'm really wondering, like, how do they cope with it? How do they handle it? Are they a little bit worried about it, or do they just do it and see where they end up? Because now we know a lot of stuff about control, about those royals, and about those techniques, like as a modern day brewer, which we have to think about, like the 80-degree step and so on. But like if you're doing all those things the same way during your entire life or during generations, and all of a sudden you need to change something, I can imagine that the beer won't be the same anymore, and that maybe it won't be nice anymore.
Yeah, but this is actually one of the big differences I feel between modern brewers and the farmhouse brewers. That the farmhouse brewers are much more relaxed. They don't have this sense of, if I do this, that will be wrong because the theory says, or people say, or the books say that you shouldn't be doing this. You see a lot of this on forums, right? People ask, "Oh, I did this. Is it gonna kill me or the beer or whatever?" But the farmhouse brewers are much more, well, okay, maybe we should try this because it could be better. And then they try it and they taste the beer, and it's like, if it's better, they'll keep doing it, and if it's not better, they're not going to keep doing it. And they seem not to fuss about this at all. And sometimes it's really simple things like just changing the pitch temperature for the yeast, for example. But I have seen cases where they go from making boiled beer to making raw ale, and when you ask them why, it's like, well, it's easier and we don't have to have the kettle and it saves time, so it just makes sense. And then some of them say, yeah, well, we should buy a kettle because I liked it better when we were boiling, and I'll talk about that for a while, but it's like, it's not a big thing. They're not overly fussed about it. And that's actually one thing I love. There's so many things that you hear them say they're going to do something, and you think, oh, that's probably going to be really hard, and then you see them do it. It's like, it wasn't a problem at all. You can't really see why you thought it would be difficult. And I really love that attitude. I really like that.
I think also another way to say farmhouse brewer is to be a practical brewer who is embedded in a rural context. Because I think that's the approach to brewing. It's practical brewing. So I don't think, now I've not met, but I would just, it's like a farmer. A farmer, his truck breaks down. He doesn't have a wheel. He will improvise the wheel. There's a way of approaching reality and making choices that is not concerned with how the job has to be done, because it's like, let's say the weather, it changes constantly and you adapt to it. Like the brewer is a person who adapts. So I think that's also is quite interesting because it brings other questions about where I go very often to Franconia. I also organize a Franconian beer festival here in Amsterdam. And one thing that I find fascinating is that you go to these Franconian small countryside breweries, and all of them use pretty much the same hops, the same malts. like the same 3 different yeast cultures, and all of these beers manage to taste different. And how come that I can have an IPA shipped from San Diego or any place in the world, and it manages to taste exactly the same as the IPA brewed by another brewery down the street, even though it's 6 different hop varieties in there. It's using totally different molds. So the interesting thing is, well, one thing I think we are generally very interested in, how can you enlarge the influence of the minute details, like the small details, rather than close it down? And I think that's where Farmhouse Brewing, and not only Farmhouse, but also, let's say, Franconian Countryside Brewing, Soigel culture, which I think has a lot of similarity, not per se with the beers brewed in the Farmhouse Brewing culture we are talking about, but like in the kind of approach as a brewer. But like, how can this different approach to brewing open up new possibilities in creating flavors, or opening flavors emerging?
Yeah, so it's a case of, yeah, so instead of trying to brew to a particular beer, like a particular taste, it's just brew, and kind of you have an idea what's going to come up, but it's going to be different every time, and just accept that. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't know. It's like the beautiful thing is that you go. I think British brewing also falls a little bit into this category. Is that you can go to the same brewer 10 times, and the beer will taste quite different each time. Yet you can put your finger on it that it's a beer from that brewery. So basically, that's what we are talking about. It's not so much about nailing this minute detail, but about still creating a fingerprint, but that is within a range of flavor. You know, it's like the variety changes, the mold is different. Sometimes there are so many changes, but how can you still establish enough character that this change is not perceived as the main thing with this change, but just, you know, like a movement.
Yeah.
And that has a lot to do, like if you look at like go back to Scandinavian brewing, or that like the techniques of control or not control. I mean, the shift to a lot of breweries now using closed fermenters, to yeast pitching, yeast board every 3 batches from the labs. There's like a minimalization of differences. And if you just look at earlier brewing regimes, there's a lot more variety. I mean, a lot of beer styles emerged out of different brewing installations. And now we are approaching it the other way around. We think we can brew every beer style on exactly the same type of installation. You know, so there's obviously quite a lot of tension in between of that.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting, because I mean, what Lars obviously says, you know, if you go through his book and that, like, there are so many different setups there that he's seen. Some of them very custom built, like, you know, for boiling hop tea and things like that. But yeah, what you're saying, like, each of those would make a different beer, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like one thing which we are doing something, we are calling this beer Scandinavian beers, but we are grouping them based on a few techniques that are basically practical decisions, and therefore we group them. They share probably a lot of things, but also there's probably a lot of subtypes which don't benefit from the frame that we are choosing currently by grouping them, which will become more apparent over time. So.
Right. Sorry, just thinking there. Sorry, just Declan's still trying to get in here, but he can't. So I'm just checking his messages there. But unfortunately, he won't be able to make it. It looks like he can't get, for whatever reason, he can't get his camera working. So anyway, so yeah, just to come back. Sorry, I just got there. I'm just trying to think where I was going.
Lars, I'm very curious. Like I remember reading 2-3 years ago that you didn't find much sources on like German farmhouse brewing. But have you, over the last years, come across anything?
There is, in the book, I have a section about Westphalia. And I know an archive that has more on the north coast. And then there is another archive that has 4 million index cards with answers about traditional German culture. And there seems to be some questions about beer brewing in there, but how detailed it is, I don't know. I'm hoping to be able to look at that in January. But whether it comes off will depend a little bit on COVID, I think. So, but there is material on Germany. It's just very, very, very hard to find, but it does exist.
And when did it stop? Like, because I'm not aware of any brewing culture really existing anymore on like small farms or anything. But
It did exist in the 1950s. There are some people saying it lived on until the 1970s, but I haven't been able to confirm that. It probably doesn't exist anymore.
So basically, yeah, Scandinavia is pretty much the epicenter of, or actually Lithuania probably as well.
Yeah, it's Finland, Gotland, parts of Norway, a little bit in Denmark, some in the UK. There's Belarus, Baltics, of course, and Russia in Europe that I know of.
And do each of those, in your experience, do they have kind of their own, that you could tell it's from, say, Norway, Norwegian farm, Lithuanian farm, or is it just a mix, a melange of things, or can you spot a national or regional characteristic?
I don't think I would say that you could taste kind of the national borders. For example, Stjørdalsøl and Gotlandsdrikke are quite similar. And there's nothing with Safti. Maybe you could recognize the baker's yeast, but then they use the same one in Estonia, so it is kind of a melange. Yes, there's a lot of regional differences, and I would say each of the regions have their special characteristics, but it's not like you can assemble it into this is Norwegian, this is German. That doesn't make sense, really.
Right. Yeah. So it's very regional.
Yes.
And Belgium, does Belgium still? I mean, Belgium's kind of a unique case. I don't know, Janis, you come in here because Belgium obviously kept this. When it was dying out everywhere else, it kept a very strong beer culture. But I don't know how much of it is farm based. Like there was the abbey based ones and that, but.
Of course, you have the abbey-based ones, and then the farmhouse that turned into saison. But I think Lambic is probably like the closest to what we could call farmhouse. Or also the way that it evolved 20, 30 years ago. Like it was also like a style which was basically the Belgians, they didn't like it anymore until the Americans came, and they hyped it up and they started buying bottles. And now I think Lambic is one of the most hyped up products in the world. Like it's probably the cheapest beer to make, ingredient wise. Of course, you need some barrels and some time and some space for it, but ingredients wise, it's the cheapest. And if you see the prices for those bottles, it's crazy. But I think the approach on brewing, the rudimental basic approach, is pretty similar to a lot of farmhouse brewers. Like stepping into a brewery like that, or stepping into a shed where a home brewer is brewing, and if it makes me shiver, I'm happy. That's the same thing the first time that I stepped into Cantillon, and you saw all those barrels that were covered with fungus. Like, yeah, it's hard to believe that if you brew that way, that you can brew decent beer. But real farmhouse brewing is dead in Belgium. The closest we still have is Lambic.
Yeah, and like I said, a lot of that is, I mean, the Lambics, like I said, they're a bit overhyped because a lot of them, it's even the same wort and the same, it's down to the blending then, I suppose.
It's done in the, wow. Is it, I think a hype is always ridiculous. Is it a beautiful product? Definitely. Do we have overhyped blenders or brewers? also definitely. Do we have underestimated? It's it's hard to see the difference if you're talking about hypes. We have a lot of good producers here, and some sell their bottles for ridiculous amounts and sell them for €10 for a bottle, which is pretty cheap.
I mean, maybe lambic is an interesting example to talk about how a beer type or a local beer brewed changes. Because 10 years ago, if you would have asked me, I would have said that a lambic, like a goose, is a beer blended with specific ratio of wheat, specific turbid mash, specific process, and in very much most cases, this is also a blend of wort produced at different breweries. Whereas I think if we look at the gooses produced nowadays in the last 3 years, most of them are actually single brewery products. Whereas 10 years ago, they were usually blends of like wort produced at 3 or 4 or 5 different breweries. And I think we can definitely talk about that goose has changed, because if the wort is produced at one brewery only, there's much less variety, but it also has pushed goose or lambic in a very specific direction, which has been beneficial. But I'm sure that you could have produced similar, or like you could have produced similar excellence, but very different flavors by trying to improve on this process of using different breweries to produce wort. But it's also something that is rarely talked about. And I think this is how change usually happens. It's not like in the big conceptual elements that we all recognize, but it's slowly happening through practical steps, one at a time, until it's clearly standing out enough that it can be named.
I have a question here from Radu. He wants to know about an experience with Gruits and no hop beers. Does that overlap with the raw and farmhouse ale styles? Where does that fit in, I guess, is the question.
It seems that the hops entered into farmhouse brewing, at least in some areas, relatively late. And I think you can say that most of the farmhouse ales that are being still made traditionally today, they're not really very defined by the hops. In a lot of cases, you get the impression that the hops are there as a way to prevent infection, and really it's the juniper that's doing the job. And it seems that you don't have to go very far back before the herbals start showing up. Merkegale, wormwood, yarrow, all of these kind of classic brewing herbs. But it doesn't seem that people were thinking herbal, hop, no hop, that this was an important category for the farmhouse brewers. It mattered to them whether they were using these herbs or not, but whether the how do I put it? Herbal beer or root beer was never a kind of concept, it seems, in farmhouse brewing, if I can put it that way. And some, particularly in Finland, also to some extent in Sweden, hops seem never to have broken through completely.
Yeah, because obviously, people now just talk about Gruits, and it's almost like Janis was saying there about lambics. It's become a fashionable thing that people are probably willing to pay lots of money for. But
I have to say I don't like the term Gruit, because really that was a method of taxation, and it doesn't have anything to do with the beer. These cities were charging breweries for this mix of herbs, and it was a way to tax the breweries, and it only existed in like the Low Countries and a very small part of Germany. The rest of the world never had it, never used the word, never had the concept. Although of course they did make herbal beers without hops, but so I think if you want to say beer without hops, then maybe you should say beer without hops. But that's just a hobby horse of mine.
Right. Yeah, it's at the risk of getting hyped as well. I guess you have a term to just latch onto for people to understand, and that's it. So where do you think Farmhouse Brewing, I mean, Lars, you've obviously done a huge amount in just kind of bringing it back to people's attention and, what's there. Where do you think it's going, or what do you think the future is?
That's an interesting question. I have to say I don't really know. I mean, it looks like there will be an upswing for the real farmhouse brewers, the traditional brewers in the traditional areas, at least for say the next decade or two, based on exactly this growth in interest. And then after that, well, that's very, very hard to say. It could be, for example, that in some of these regions, you get beer tourism, and that becomes a driver of keeping the tradition alive. That could also end up distorting it. Or freezing it, which is a form of death, I guess. That's very, very difficult to say. And then what happens in the world of commercial brewing is, I guess, even harder to say. It's beginning to look to me like the world of commercial brewing is kind of splitting up a little bit, that you have people following this commercial popular route of New England IPAs and pastry stouts and all of that stuff, and that there's a lot of people who don't want to go this way, and they want to go, I'm not sure I'm going to call it back to the roots, but back to more beer tasting like beer. And I think Farmhouse Brewing has little chance of reaching the first group, but it does have a chance of reaching the second group. How that's going to play out, I really don't know. I don't think Farmhouse Ale and methods have had huge traction so far. Let's put it that way.
Right. What do you think? Do you think it's, well, one, has it started gaining traction, do you think, Jan or Janis or Eric? Or do you think it's reached its kind of plateau or something or anything?
I think it will always be a difficult product. The drinking crowd there really takes them some time to change, and now I'm talking for Belgian drinkers. Belgian drinkers, they're so accustomed to what they're drinking their entire life. They're not willing to change a lot, and if they're changing, they're changing a lot to still pretty accessible flavors. And I'm saying that now as a, well, I won't call myself frustrated, but like I'm a brewer who loves to experiment with really ancient techniques and old beer styles and name it, and I really want to make a beautiful beer with it. But every time, or like an ancient German style or whatever, every time we brew a beer like that, like some people they approach me and they say like, "Oh, dude, this is the best beer that the brewery has ever made. Keep on doing that." And those are the only people who love it. Seriously, or the other people they have a sip and say, interesting, and they let their glass stand, and at the end of the road, we're a commercial brewery, so we need to think about our stock too. So if we brew a beer and it's stuck in stock, then we're actually, we don't like that, of course. We also want our beers to sell, and it's always finding a balance for me then as a brewer to brew interesting ancient styles, but also listen to the popular demand. We're a brew pub, and we don't want 15 taps of beers that people won't drink. But every once in a while we sneak in a really interesting style to let them be accustomed to it. And that was the whole idea about the Farmhouse Day every year before COVID. Step by step. I don't believe we're gonna attract a big group, but I think we can gain some souls.
Sorry, I'm kind of jumping around here because it just brings me back to what you mentioned earlier, that we didn't mention yeast at all, and Kveik, where that comes in, because that is obviously getting some commercial, where's it put? Is it commercial just because it's trying to, like, for the flavors or for the speed, the temperature? Is it getting its maximum benefit, I guess?
I think the flavor profile and the aroma profile of Kveik yeast, of Kveik, basically Kveik yeast, but the same thing, is that it doesn't come to its complete benefit, because nowadays brewers, they use Kveik because it ferments fast, because they don't need to cool, because it's just such an easy yeast to work with, and most of the beers they use it for are IPAs. So yeah, they're beautiful yeast, but they're not used in the right way. And then all those yeast laboratories which sell yeast culture from a certain farm, they basically sometimes just pick out one yeast strain, and it's a mixed culture. So they sell it as the culture of the farm. So I'm happy to see that there's something that Kveik is moving, but yeah, it's because of its popularity, it's losing its.
Second, my dog's barking.
Well, I think also the economic model of many of the existing current breweries being very much inspired craft breweries has exhausted itself to a certain point. Like there's only limited innovation possible. I don't know if you can actually call it a cycle, but within that cycle, because most of these breweries are basically economic spreadsheet breweries. And if you don't have a past, you also can't have a future. You know, you have to come from somewhere. You must have a specific perspective for you to develop actually something going forward. And I mean, that is a fact. I just think one of the reasons why there's so much similarity between so many breweries right now is because if you scrape away the historical perspective of a brewer or of a brewery and replace it with a rather technical approach to brewing, where you're just kind of doing what is suggested, there isn't much possibilities. But that said, I'm actually not hopeful, but I totally see the possibilities for farmhouse brewing or no hop brewing or to emerge locally. Like, it can only come through small local breweries producing it for their local environment, where people don't drink it as like, oh, this is a great style and the bottles will travel quite far away, but where it's literally just the local appreciated beer and it grows out from there, but not per se even with the idea that it's a brewery that travels to craft beer festivals and presents the beer there, but it's just a beer that is consumed by the local drinkers. And I wouldn't see what is stopping anybody from doing that. You just need one enthusiast setting up a brewery in a smaller town or village and basically get the locals on board by selling it as beer, not as like, oh, there's this Scandinavian or Latvian or Belgium raw ale thing. It's just the local beer.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's maybe a very good hopeful note to kind of finish on. Yeah, because I mean, I've seen this a lot, that, you know, local is, people are really looking for local now. It's beginning to become a big issue. And then if you have your local brewery, you don't need to know necessarily that they're brewing all these fancy beers, like fancy in terms of, you know, triple IPAs and double IPAs and all of that, but they're brewing just a local beer that's made with local ingredients. And that is something that you should be looking, people should be, and I think are starting to look for.
I mean, once you understand beer as an institution, you know, even in the local sense, I mean, why do people drink New England IPAs? Partly because they might like the flavor profiles, but also partly because it's part of the culture they like to be part of. And it's obviously a self-fulfilling culture, you know? And I mean, as Lars said, people start to talk about farmhouse brewing in Sweden or Norway again. And that gives it also a bit of a claim to continue and for people to develop in it. So it's like, I think beer starts with the culture and not so much with the beer. And we often approach it, obviously, as brewers or working breweries, from the perspective of like the beer, the process, the specific steps. But it's very much, the beer is shaped by the drinking culture, and the drinking culture is shaped by the beer. And that is all a result of the environment, and that continues.
Yeah, that's always been the case, I suppose. Okay, listen, lads. We've been nearly an hour and a half now, so maybe I won't hold you too much longer. Is there anything we kind of didn't address about all of this that we should have? Nope.
There's some things about the brewing that we didn't talk about. So one is the mash temperatures. My experience has been that you want to mash higher because the enzymes will keep working afterwards in the fermenter. So that's one thing that's good to be aware of. And the other is this thing that Janis was talking a little bit about, that how do I call it? The sediment. When you brew and when you drink a wheat beer, the sediment is really a big part of the flavor, and like Janis said, it tends to settle out. And when you make raw ale, that's really something you have to be careful with both when you are brewing, because you want the right amount of sediment to come into the beer, and it can be an issue if it settles out afterwards. It seems very difficult to predict how it's going to behave. So I've seen commercial versions where the sediment is perfect, it floats, everything's great, and then other ones where it really sticks to the bottom and you get these lumps that Janis was talking about, and you lose a lot of the mouthfeel and the flavor because the sediment just isn't part of the beer. It's settled. But exactly how to control that, I don't know. It's just that's an issue.
So anything, yeah. So Eric or Jan or Janis, anything you've seen there in the brewing techniques when you've tried to do farmhouse beers, anything like that that's jumped out at you? That, I mean, you're writing it or developing a course on a PhD. So is there anything there that you're transferring across into that course?
I think pH and polyphenol content are a big issue there. If you get the right pH and the right, basically the hops. If you add too much hops, they'll attach to the polyphenols and eventually they'll drop down. Same with the pH. If the pH is too low, they'll eventually also settle down. But I haven't done enough research about that, or I haven't got enough experience about that to make a complete opinion about it. But I think those are two important factors.
Is there anything in your course that's going to be kind of on this kind of rule of thumb, things like, that your stirring stick has to stand at a certain angle or anything like that?
That's really beautiful. The stick theory. Yeah. To be honest, the first time I made a replica of a beer that I saw of a Korenaar beer, basically at the Korenaar festival. I did the same thing when I came home. I put a stick in there to see how it was, and then I measured, and now I know how dense it needs to be. But it's a good technique. It works.
Yeah. And it's a cheaper technique, I suppose. It's just a stick.
Definitely.
But yeah, sorry, just one more thing before we go. So yeah, we've been talking about raw ales, and I kind of mentioned decoction there a little bit, but there's also, if I understand right, I mean, just looking, the other thing about farmhouses, they almost go the opposite side, some of them, and like the mash is boiled and that as well. So where does that fit in? Like, what does that do to the flavors and stuff? And do the same farmers do both types? Are they kind of regional?
Oh, yeah. This thing with boiling the mash is there's only some regions where people did and do that. So parts of Finland do it. Parts of Sweden used to do it. Eastern Norway. Also Western Lithuania. And where it comes from, I suspect that the origin of that is that people used to mash with the hot stones, right? And those boil the mash. Then these people buy a kettle, and of course now they have to somehow incorporate it into their technique. And it seems that some people then decided, well, if we just chuck, cold water and malts into the kettle, and then we heat it up slowly, it's going to be pretty much the same as with the stones. but you used to boil, right? So then you do the same thing. And the effect on the flavor, as far as I can tell, is absolutely nothing. Weirdly enough, that was a big thing that when we were in Finland in 2018. We were really hoping that one of these brewers that we brewed with were going to boil the mash so we could see how they were doing it and figure out the flavor. And the third one actually did boil, and then it tasted exactly like the ones that didn't. And it's the same with the one that you had, the Dunderlis John Born. Yeah. I don't taste any boiled mash flavor in that. Not at all.
I didn't know what to look for. I just like the taste of the overall beer. So
yeah, and that one has some herbals in it that makes it a little harder. But I couldn't tell any difference.
Right. But is that then in those areas? Do they not do raw ales? Everybody just boils the mash, or?
Oh, that's kind of two separate things. So some boil the mash and then they boil the wort, and some just boil the mash.
Okay.
There's no obvious connection there.
Okay, I was just wondering about that. Okay, so
we actually did a mash boil earlier this year without boiling. Maybe Eric can. It's called Maya. Maybe Eric can say something about it.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's true what Lars says. It's not a. It's. I suppose you can achieve the same flavor, but just boiling twice as long will work. But I also think you get a little bit of astringency from boiling, probably from the husks. So the bitterness somehow is a bit pronounced, but yeah. It's really nice. You get a really nice malt flavor.
But you were saying that it was actually an attempt to reproduce Bavarian decoction mashing techniques, right? Like that was the source that you actually found.
No, the source was Swedish, from Dalarna.
Dalarna.
I found this was not quite a recipe, but some sort of description from some ethnographical survey. Some ethnographer was interviewing someone about how they made beer, or their parents or grandparents made beer in the local village. So I just tried to follow that.
And from when was that?
I think the interview is from 1933, so I suppose the late 19th century. So it was just a fun thing to experiment with.
Okay. Well, yeah. So look, I kind of don't want to hold everybody for too long. So I don't know if there's anything else, like I said, that we should cover, or that you kind of want to bring up there that I didn't bring up.
Well, we actually got a quick extra guest. Maybe do you have anything to say about Farmhouse Brewing?
All right.
Just walking.
Who do we have? Hiding there, somewhere.
No. I have nothing at all. I'm just walking in. Hi, all.
Hi, Jan.
Hi, Jan.
Long time.
So yeah, look, I don't know. I've kind of exhausted my questions a bit. I did, by the way, just do a little poll on Twitter there. Like, didn't get many, got about 40 people. But yeah, I just asked, and about 40% of people had said they'd tried it. So obviously it was a slightly skewed thing. 40% had tried a raw ale, but there was still a third of people just didn't know what it was. So I think hopefully this might help kind of educate a few people, that, you know, introduce them to something new, because it really is, like I said, I can taste the mouthfeel, but I haven't enough experience to be able to say what the flavors are. And like I said, especially when one of those two was Yoveru, which was kind of completely off the charts on everything. That was a mad beer. But I don't know, Lars, that's obviously one of your favorites. You've brought up.
Yes.
Like, the other part of that, I suppose, just to come back to the yeasts, I mean, she uses, her yeast, she has her brewing techniques and that. But where does the yeast go? I mean, she has it now, it's commercialized, but is that the whole strain? Or like, mixed culture.
It's not the whole culture. It's a single
just
strain.
one
But yeah, the thing with that is that all of modern yeast handling was based on what Emil Christian Hansen did. So all of these techniques are for working with single strains. That's what microbiologists learned to do. So learning how to reliably, consistently reproduce a mixed culture, that's something that we don't really know how to do. It's a difficult problem to solve, and I think probably a lot of people are not very motivated to solve it either, because it works with a single strain. So hey,
yeah.
But it does make a difference. You can taste the difference between one strain and having the full set.
Yeah, I know, Janis, you're developing a house strain as well. I think you told me the last time you're slowly developing one from kind of different beers that you're kind of growing and developing along the way.
Yeah, that's right. Basically, we always recover yeast from our barrels. Well, it started as a big joke during the first Dochter Brewing Festival. It wasn't really a joke, but it was an experiment that all the wild beer producers, we asked them to bring one bottle, and basically we propagated one big wild yeast culture. Then we did a clean fermentation on the barrels, clean fermentation on the tanks, and pitched them on the barrels. And now every time we're selecting the barrels which we're particularly keen of, and now it's we're about getting to third generation now. And it's pretty nice because the characteristics from the beginning, they're really evolving in the way that we'd like them to evolve. Of course, we need to be very cautious with not jinxing it, because handling yeast can all of a sudden it can if it doesn't want to work anymore, it doesn't want to work anymore. We don't have a laboratory here to manage our yeast, so we're doing it really old school.
And yeah, so things like, yeah, you're doing, like, you're developing a new one, but like we said, you overrule what they've commercialized as a single strain. So at some point, presumably that will be gone. The actual yeast that they have now.
It's possible, but I think that Omega yeast has the full culture. And I've been thinking that I should perhaps collect some and put it in my freezer as well, just to be sure.
Sounds like a good plan.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, good. Yeah, I'm hoping to get back and try that one again someday. I still kind of, it's been a while since I had it now. I only had that time, but yeah, you can still taste the complexity in that one, even months later.
Yeah, it's a fantastic beer, and it seems to be. It's kind of like what Jan was saying earlier. It's a beer that it always tastes different every time that you have it, but you still recognize it.
Yeah. Well, again, I've only had it one time, so I couldn't say that I'd recognize it. But yeah, I kind of get what you're saying and what Jan was saying, the point he was making there about that. Okay, listen, I'm going to let you go this time. I've tried 3 times, but something always popped into my head again afterwards. So I'll ask one last time. Is there anything that we should have talked about that we didn't? Anything that we mentioned or didn't mention, or anything? Or should we just go? Nope. Looks like everybody's finished, I think. Listen, guys, thanks a million for the time. Hopefully, like I said, hopefully it'll help some people get interested, get to go and taste farmhouse beers, raw ales, and maybe even that, go for the beer tourism, which hopefully won't kill and stagnate everything. But it was a great chat, and I want to thank all of you. Unfortunately, like I said, Declan in Otterbank just couldn't connect for some reason. His camera wasn't working, and Amund for Mike and Tid also had to. He had a family emergency and he couldn't make it. So unfortunately, they sent their apologies, but there wasn't anything they could do. Maybe we'll get them back some other time, and maybe we can get G back as well at the same time. We can find some other angle to attack this from. So that's it. So listen, I'll just tell you that next week we have another session, but we have Oso from Spain, St. Mel's from Ireland, and Valduc from Belgium taking part. Hopefully it'll be as entertaining and as interesting as this. And I hope we'll see everybody. Thanks a million again for taking the time. I'll just play out a video here to kind of finish it all off and let you know what's happening next week. Thanks a million.